This is the beginning of a series of debates, discussions, seminars, which Emmanuelle Saada is chairing, professor in history. I'm going to put that first. The French will be French department.
Can you speak up, please?
Yes,
Well,
certainly.
use the mic.
So what we're doing tonight is we're beginning a series dealing with broader questions of the European crisis, austerity, political economy, and I wanted to introduce to you Emmanuelle Saada, who will be introducing in turn Mark Blyth, and we're very, very grateful for him to be here. When we thought of the series, we thought in terms of a broader project on austerity, and here we have Mark, who is actually just come out with this book. It's really fresh off the press. We didn't have copies of it before. And so it's both an inauguration of the series and also the debut of Mark here, back here, speaking about his book. I wanted to alert you to another event. We've actually been working on a couple of lines here. So one thing that you can come to Blinken Institute's European Institute to find out about is questions relating to political economy, the European crisis, and broader and deeper perspectives on it. But we've also been working on questions related to the new diplomacy, to cultural diplomacy, working with the colleagues in journalism, and tomorrow evening in the same building at 6:15 there will be a roundtable sponsored with the journalism school, chaired by Anya Schifrin, which brings in various State Department and other types, again contemporary and with historical perspective on questions relating to the new public diplomacy. So now let me turn it over to you, Emmanuelle.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. First, I will signal that there is a, for the graduate students, there is a breakfast tomorrow morning at 8:15 at Deluxe, only for graduate students. You don't have to register, you just show up at Deluxe 8:15. You all know that Deluxe is on Broadway between 1:12 and 1:13. So we're delighted tonight to have Mark Blyth at the Blinken European Institute. Mark Blyth knows Columbia very well. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia in 1999, and is now, after teaching at Johns Hopkins University, is now Brown. Sorry, you've always been at Brown. You're now at Brown.
I used to be at Johns Hopkins, and then I fled Baltimore after 10 years.
I'm sorry. So after teaching at Johns Hopkins, is now teaching at Brown. He's a professor of international political economy at Brown University. That's what I meant. So most of his work has been on the connections between the life of ideas and institutional changes, especially in the economic field. His first book, is this okay?
Take that one and use this one.
His first book, can you hear me this way?
Yes.
Yes, good. So his first book, published in 2002 by Cambridge University Press, was entitled Great Transformation, Economic Ideas and Institutional Changes in the 20th Century, and it was about the connections between ideas and institutions. And after that, he co-edited or edited two important volumes that were summing up the directions and calling up for new directions in the disciplines, especially the first one I'm going to quote, the Routledge Handbook for International Political Economy, IPE as a Global Conversation, was published in 2009. And then he also edited another volume which was less about the discipline and more about the about economy, international economy as a field of practice. And that is a volume he co-edited entitled Constructing the International Economy, that was published by Cornell University Press in 2010. So in many ways, his latest book, just off the press, Austerity, the idea of a dangerous idea, which you can buy just outside of the room here, is at the intersection of those several interests, since it looks at the history, at the deep history, the long durée history of the idea of austerity in many places in the world, and at its effects in the form of deep institutional changes in the international economy. As some of you know, and as Vicky was just reminding us of, the Blinken European Institute, under the leadership of Victoria de Grazia and Christopher Hill, has just launched a new initiative on the question of austerity, a word that, as you all know, is very much the order of the day in Europe. And the initiative, I think, has for its first and major goal, the objective to expand the kind of reflection that is going on right now in Europe and elsewhere in the world from a very kind of new cycle, a life in the new cycle, to a deeper history and a kind of interdisciplinary approach to try to understand austerity in its long durée incarnations, and also try to think about it not only as an economic concept but also as a cultural and social concept. So we could not think of a better person than Mark Blyth to start this interdisciplinary conversation tonight, and we're very happy to have him in conversation with Professor Victoria de Grazia, who doesn't need an introduction here, but still, as all of you know, she's a professor of history at Collegiate University. She's a director of the Blinken European Institute. She's a specialist of Italian and European history. She has produced major books on gender, on fascism, on gender and fascism in Italy. She's also devoted a lot of her work and attention to the idea and notion of consumer cultures. And I think in many ways she's, like Mark Blyth, has been very interested in the larger field of political economy in Europe. So here we have two major contributors who are going to be in dialogue on this issue. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for the introduction. I think I have a clip mic, so this should be working. Right, that's better. I'm going to stand up. The reason I stand up is because if I sit down, I get bored. And so do you, because it means that you start looking at a fixed point. And when you sit looking at a fixed point, your eyes do this. And you start to get the overwhelming, you know, the notion of tiredness you only get in lectures? It's because you've been sitting looking at a fixed point. So we're going to move around a bit. All right, austerity, a history of a dangerous idea. Let's get kicking on this one. Before we get to the theory, it's useful to know why I'm interested in this question. And the intellectual argument is the following. How did a bunch of stinky garbage mortgages in Los Angeles end up causing a sovereign debt crisis in the periphery of Europe? It's not exactly intuitively obvious, is it? It's not like you draw a straight line from one and go, well, that obviously causes that. More to the point, why was it mediated as a crisis of government spending, when in fact, if you spend more than 5 minutes looking at it, it's quintessentially a private sector crisis of financial markets, probably turbocharged by derivative markets in particular, has something to do with houses, but quintessentially private sector. It envelops almost all the developed world. Only one of them had a Fannie and Freddie, so you can't really blame that for everything that goes on in the world. And then that sort of washes up on the shores of Europe, and as I say, causes a problem with sovereign debt markets, which really have nothing to do with collateralized mortgage obligations. So working that out was part of it. Another thing that I wanted to do that was part of it was basically exercise some demons of my own. So why am I interested in this question? Because it really, really annoys me when people say this is all about governments who have spent too much. Let's remind ourselves of some simple facts on this one, right? You basically start off with about, through turn of the 2000s, about 32% debt to GDP in the United States. So let's have a couple of rounds of unfunded tax cuts that we're never going to pay for themselves. That'll blow your debt up a bit. Then stick a couple of wars of choice you refuse to pay any taxes to pay for, and you're at 61% of GDP by 2006. I don't remember anybody screaming about over government spending at that point in time. And then along comes the financial sector and basically blows a hole in financial space-time to the tune of $3 or $4 trillion. That takes you up to 80% of GDP. Then put in the lost GDP that comes from that, the lack of tax revenue, the deficit ballooning, etc., and you're up to 100%. So this is an orgy of government spending. Oh yeah, it is. But basically it's an orgy of government spending on Wall Street and asset protection for the people who already have everything. And the people who are meant to pay for that somehow are pensioners. There's something fundamentally wrong about that. But let's get to Europe. As you can see, it's not in great fiscal health. It's always good to look at the net debt to GDP figure rather than the gross. The gross is the big, scary number people like to say. But it also assumes basically that there are no taxes being paid, there are no assets in the national balance sheet. But nonetheless, if you look at it, it's not too great. I mean, everyone's kicking up around sort of like, 100%, 80%, etc. You'd rather not be there if you could at all help it. So who brought about this fine mess? As Laurel and Hardy would say, that being Laurel and Hardy on the left, of course. Well, the story that we get is it's this crisis of government, and they've spent all this money, and now the credit bubble's gone, the markets have freaked out, the yields have gone up, and now you have to cut. But there's actually a much more interesting story that you get if you bother to look into the banking side of this, which is the bit you never really hear. So if you go back in the day to before the euro came in, you get this spread amongst the sovereign bonds of different European countries. And this reflects, in a sense, the real risk in the bond. I mean, you're going to get 22 to 25% for holding Greek debt because it's dodgy. Right? When you're going to hold the Italian debt, it's 15%. Why? Because basically they don't have enough kids, and 30 years from now it's not clear that they're going to have enough people to actually pay back the 30-year bond when it comes to maturity. But then the euro comes in. The euro is a wonderful thing because you can tell the following story. Suddenly we're all going to be German. We're all going to be inflation phobic. Right? So all exchange rate risk is expunged because you no longer have your own currency. And all inflation risk is expunged because that's basically the same thing on a domestic level. And you're going to lock up the printing presses in Frankfurt and you're going to basically burn all the currency so you can't go back to it. So it's this kind of like, what do you call it? Strategy of like burning your bridges. You can't go back once you're in it. And this magically means that all the risk that were in these countries has been removed by this wonderful new institution called the ECB. That's a fairy story. Here's what actually happened. Why do you get this bond yield convergence? This is called a yield convergence trade, for those of you who are into financial markets. How do you make money on a decline in spread? You buy lots of it, and you lever the hell out of your balance sheet. So as the yields go down, you stuff your boots with more and more debt. So you're a bank in Germany or a bank in France. Why would you hold on to nice, boring German debt? Look at that Greek debt. It's turbocharged. And now they're all going to be in the euro. They're all going to be German. So if I'm quickly in 1992, 93 grabbing the spread as it's going down, then I'm going to make money. So if I lever up, I dump all my French debt, my Dutch debt, I get as much periphery debt as I can, I cram it into my boots, and my balance sheets go once, twice, 3 times the size they normally were. And of course, with all the banks doing this, what happens is the yields converge. And we get to this happy point when the euro comes in and everyone says, see, we have removed all of the risk. Greece, who has never run a surplus in 50 years, suddenly has the same bond rating as the Germans. It's all gone. It's all magically gone away. That's great. And then, of course, it stays like this because the entire world is engorging itself on a wonderful credit binge. And then when the credit bubble pops, guess what? All the yield spreads come back to where you were before. Now, this creates a bit of a problem if you're one of those big banks that's been stuffing your balance sheet filled with periphery debt. Specifically, this is what happens. It means that the periphery debt of Italy, Portugal, and Spain in 2011 was effectively 32% of the GDP of France crammed into the balance sheet of 3 banks. So if those debts are bad, and that bank is levered up 30 to 1, a 3% turn against its assets is going to render it illiquid, if not insolvent. And given it doesn't have its own printing press anymore, whoops, it gave it to the Germans, you got a bit of a problem because you can't bail yourself out. You can't inflate your way out of it. You can't devalue your way out of it. So the only thing you've got is what they've been doing for the past several years. Squeeze, add liquidity, and pray, otherwise known as the Trichet put. So France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Germany, and the UK are seriously hawking to a bunch of sovereigns who managed to sell all that debt to core banks because the core banks went on a spending spree because it was in their interest to do so because it was a nice way of doing a yield convergence trade before the euro came in and it was free money until it wasn't because then all the risk shows up on the balance sheet. The result is, ready for this? Assets held by banks in Germany, France, and the UK are about double the annual GDP of the entire EU. That's banking assets. That's the total GDP of the European Union. What happens if 10% of those assets are crap and are never coming back and you're levered at 40 to 1? That's why the Greeks can't leave. Because if they leave, it's a trigger point. And that trigger goes to Portugal, and then it goes from Portugal to Ireland. And Ireland is actually sitting on real terms about 170% debt to GDP. It's got about 45 billion euros in a bad bank called NAMA with assets that are never ever coming back. So you do a bank run around the bond market of the European sovereigns, and where does it go? It goes back to these countries, and it blows up the core banks. That's what this whole story is about. The reason we have to be austere is we're still saving the banks. The difference is the Europeans don't have a real central bank, and they don't have Uncle Ben. Because Uncle Ben can reach into the balance sheet of the bad banks, pull the assets out, stick it on the balance sheet, call it Maiden Lane 2 so that nobody knows what it is, add as much liquidity as he wants in quantitative easing and asset swaps, suppress global yields, and then basically clean and delever the system. The ECB can't do that. It is constitutionally, institutionally, and intellectually incapable of doing so. For comparison, the too-big-to-bail USA is about 61% of GDP in the top 5 banks. So the threat of Lehman, which wasn't even one of the top 5, going bang, was enough to send Uncle Sam running to the monetary tool shed. At least the Brits have their own currency. That's British GDP. That's the assets of the British banking system. Whoops. Anybody here French? Start crying. Because basically, there is French GDP. And Pays-Bas, Crédit Agricole, and Soc Gen on their own dwarf the sovereign. You don't have a printing press anymore. Crédit Agricole has got 10% of its balance sheet in crap Spanish assets that are never coming back, and that's just the real estate loans. Run. Now, if that goes bad, it's game over for the euro and the core banks. That's what this is really all about. All the stuff about Greeks spending too much money, nonsense. All the stuff about they don't pay taxes, they spend basically about a few percentage points below the median tax take of every other OECD country. This is all convenient fictions. Why are we doing it? Because it's all about stopping a bank run around the bond market. But here's the problem. When you're the EU, when you're the ECB, when you don't have the tools that Bernanke has, you can't solve a banking problem with budget cuts. You can slash Greek public spending to Neolithic levels, and they are really trying. They have lost 30% of GDP in 4 years. The Wehrmacht didn't do that. It's not going to do anything for Soc Gen's balance sheet. Not a damn thing, because that's where the problem actually lies. You can't run a gold standard in a democracy. We learned that in the 1930s, but you can try. Because basically what you're running in the euro is a hard money regime. It's a gold standard without gold. You cannot inflate, you cannot devalue, you can only deflate or you face default. It's exactly the same principle as the gold standard. You cannot solve a solvency problem with a liquidity instrument, but God bless Trichet because he tried it, and then after that, God bless Mario because he's been trying it. All you do is squeeze, add liquidity, and pray. What's keeping the entire banking sector afloat in Greece and in Ireland is a thing called emergency liquidity assistance, which is officially when the ECB itself tells the national central bank to go and print as much money as it needs, but kind of keep it off the books. That's actually what's been going on. And the key lesson of the whole thing for austerity is a very simple one. You cannot all cut simultaneously when you're each other's trading partners on the zero bound and expect to grow. If you imagine the economy as a fraction, let's say you've got 80% debt to GDP, I'll give you a fraction of 4/5. Now let's say that the government spends half of GDP and it decides to cut half of its spending. So round it up, so it takes about 20% of GDP out. So boom, massive, massive cuts. You've turned 4/5 into 4/4. On a constant stock of GDP, you've just went from 80 to 100%. Every single country that's undergone an austerity program since 2009 now has more debt rather than less. And that is including controlling for the losses from the financial sector and the cost of direct and indirect bailouts. It simply doesn't work. Einstein's definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This has become a bit mad. So why did anybody ever think this is a good idea? I like to call this the political theory of an absence, which immediately makes me think this is an earlier version of the slides because I changed that subtitle. At least I thought I did. We'll wing it. Right, who's that? John Locke, handsome fella. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. The key one is his 5th chapter. If you have a look at John Locke's 2nd treatise, it's a wonderful, wonderful text because basically he invents property. Basically, it's all there in common. God gives us it in common, but basically there's a problem with spoilage. So in the state of nature, we invent money. That allows us to alienate our property, and that gives us property rights, and there's more than enough for everyone, so why should we care? Slight problem with that. When you invent appropriation markets and money, you also invent alienation of product and wages. But the problem with this is when you let markets do what markets do, they create incredible inequalities. I'll give you a Smith quote in a minute that outlines this one. And when you do this, you have to have a market that can police those. You have to have a state that can police the inequalities the market produces. Otherwise, the people who are on the bad end of the drill are going to come and basically burn your house down. So you have a problem right away, which is the liberal distrust of the state. You can't trust the state because any state powerful enough to defend your property rights might actually come after you, hence the Second Amendment and all that good stuff. However, any state that you want that could actually defend your property rights is going to be expensive, which means you're going to have to pay for it. Thus a dilemma is born. You can't live without it, you can't live with it, and you don't want to pay for it. So how do you pay for it if you don't want to pay any taxes and you're a good liberal subject? Well, what you do is you turn to David Hume. Because David Hume notes the growth of debt markets by the sovereign in Britain around the time that he's writing. And he's appalled by this. As he says, public credit will destroy the nation. Why is this? Well, it's a wonderful thing about if you read his essay on money, because a lot of modern macro is still sitting in that essay. The long-run neutrality of money and various other bits are all sitting there. And a wonderful thing he says is that merchants are the most, he calls them the most excellent race of men. Because when you give them money, they use it better than anyone else. So that's why they should have most of the gains. So the problem here is that they want this state, because they'll get most of the gains. So people who don't have most of the gains, who'd be the majority of people, will get kind of fed up with that. So they're going to try and take their stuff from them. So you need to call the state, and the state comes in. But you don't want to pay for the state. So what do? Debt. What a brilliant scam. It's a free option. Here's how this works. Basically, you're the state. You're going to issue a debt instrument, and you're going to pay me money for basically lending you money. So the thing that I need to pay for, I no longer pay for. You pay for it because you're giving me the debt instrument. Brilliant. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, there's a slight problem, and this goes right to the heart of the liberal aversion with debt. If you're going to do this, the rate of interest you would have to offer on the debt instrument would have to be better than the rate of return in the real economy. Consequently, first ever instance of crowding out. So you start to basically move money away from the good side of the economy into the non-productive debt sector. You become addicted to debt. You issue more and more debt. You have to give more and more interest. It sucks more and more of it in. And as Hume says, first we indebt ourselves, then we indebt foreigners, then we indebt our children, and eventually this easing out, this easy money and crowding out results in the death of the nation. Slight problem with this rendition of events. Just when he published that essay, England, who had just accumulated a huge stock of debt after the Napoleonic Wars, massively reduced its debt and went on to dominate the world for about 115 years. So putting that sort of sample error to one side, let's turn to Adam Smith, who also said that the funding, the practice of funding, basically debt, has gradually enfeebled every state that has adopted it. Now, Smith is, of course, one of those wonderful people that's often quoted and never read. And if you really get into what Smith had to say about this stuff, it's quite fascinating. The short version goes like this. Everything comes from being a parsimonious Presbyterian Calvinist Scot. Parsimony is absolutely the virtue. Prodigality, spending, definitely not. And he goes on at length about this in the book. Why? Because ultimately the act of saving automatically produces investment. Jean-Baptiste Say takes us 50 years later, turns it into Say's law. Now the problem is, and he recognizes this too, this is the quote I was going to reference, and he says in Book 2 of The Wealth of Nations, for every rich man you must have 500 poor. And that rich man must live every time in fear because of the jealousy of others. And if it is not for the firm hand of the magistrate, he would not only live in fear, he would be unable to keep his capital safe. Favorite quote from Smith. Civil government, insofar as it is instituted for the protection of the rich against the poor, or those who have property against those who have none. That is not a Karl Marx quote. That is Adam Smith. He is absolutely honest about this. Now, here's the thing. If you're going to have the state that's going to be effective, you're going to have to pay for it again. So he writes a lot about taxes, and it's interesting. Adam Smith comes out in terms of proportional taxation. Yeah, that's wonderful. The guy's a progressive. And you're like, well, actually, no. He quickly backs away from it. Because, of course, it would mean the rich people would pay most of the taxes, and he's one of the rich people. He doesn't want to do that. So basically, he goes for a very modern solution, which modern-day Republicans are fond of, a consumption tax, a national sales tax on everything except luxuries. But then he realizes that's not going to raise enough revenue. So what are you left with? You're going to have to do debt. But once you do debt, you're on that slippery slope. Because if taxation isn't going to rescue you, what does debt do? It perverts parsimony. You're no longer the Scot who saves. You're the profligate, the one who's loading up debt rather than investing in capital and in the growth of the economy itself. So you have this pessimism built into early liberalism, that debt is both the proximate solution to the problem of funding and the ultimate end of the state itself. That is the liberal neuralgia. That is why basically austerity becomes, if you will, the aspirin that you take whenever you have the headache of debt as it appears over time. So, I call this in the book the producing austerity by default. You have the can't live with it, can't live without it, and don't want to pay for it problem of the state. The state is at one time the antithesis, but also the catalyst, and also the policeman that makes the market possible. And this is an absence because it's not until you get to the early 20th century that the state is actually big enough to cut in terms of having any effect on budgets. But right from the start, there is that terrible, terrible fear of government debt built into it. So this is liberalism's neuralgia and the aspirin of austerity. Now, Two handsome fellas there, David Ricardo on the left, and who's got it? Somebody said it? John Stuart Mill, exactly, well done. And basically what happens in the 19th century, with the growth of the state and state responsibilities, building from the Factory Acts, etc., you begin to get a more interventionist form of liberalism as a practical thing. And this creates a split in liberal economic thinking. Down one track goes Ricardo, who basically says, don't like it, don't want to pay for it, don't think it does anything good, to hell with it. And actually Austrian economics follows that, and you get Mises and Hayek and the rest. Then you get the new liberalism, which ultimately leads us from Mill, going through Hobson, Newhouse, etc., and ending up with John Maynard Keynes. So there's two tracks. The first track that becomes important in the early 20th century is, who's this one? And he actually looks like that. This is not an exaggeration. It's a brilliant, brilliant picture. Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter was, of course, the post-war Austrian finance minister who used to run around in a carriage with two concubines at any point in time, apparently. Who knew? And basically didn't do such a great job of it. Then became the chairman of the economics department at Harvard University. Funny how that becomes a job for failed finance ministers. I'm not drawing any causal links there, just leaving that one out there. And he epitomized that sort of Austrian Ricardian tradition, which became the American academic economic tradition in the early 20th century, of what was called modern business cycle theory, which is really, really similar to real business cycle theory that people talk about just now. And the basic idea is the economy has this long-run capital structure. And we don't really know it, we can't really see it, no one can sort of like get outside of the economy to see it in total. So what you can do basically is avoid tinkering with it at all costs. But clearly what's happened is there's been too much of the wrong type has been built, there's been a misallocation of capital. This is usually financed by banks that go crazy, and what you need to do is just let the whole thing go bang, and then the clock resets and we start again. That's the standard binge and purge story. I like to call it emetic economics. And you have to, and then you chuck the whole thing up. So that's basically one version of it. The Brits, of course, have their own version of this, which is actually a more refined version of exactly the same thing, which is what you'd expect from the state, from the Brits in this one. So basically their version is, as Joan Robinson had it in an article, that for close to 50 years the doctrine of laissez-faire had dominated the minds not of the governing classes, as Keynes had put it, but of the financial, intellectual, and practical too. So this is the name of the game. Hands off, get on the gold standard, let trade go. Well, why not? You're the center of the global economy. You run the gold standard. You're basically the hegemon for the whole system. It's great. Unfortunately, World War I comes along and you're bankrupt, but you don't want to admit that. So what do you want to do? Well, you've got a choice. You can either devalue and kickstart your economy, or you can have a very high exchange rate and go back on the gold standard, which you would need to do if you've got lots and lots of other foreigners holding sterling assets. Because if they get a whiff that you're going to devalue, they dump all the assets and the pound goes to zero anyway. Caught between a rock and a hard place, they decide to go back on the gold standard at a high exchange rate. The result, massive increase in unemployment and stagnation through the 1920s and increasing debt through the whole period. Keynes, originally supportive of these policy, writes a pamphlet in response to Lloyd George's pamphlet called Can Lloyd George Do It?, which talks about utility of public work spending. In response, the Treasury writes the memorandum on certain proposals on employment that makes two arguments, which are exactly the same arguments we've heard before and we continue to hear today. The first one is modernist version, is called Ricardian Equivalence. If people know that the spending now ultimately has to be paid by tax raises in the future, then they'll discount the effect of the spending now so it won't actually do anything. So investment is null and void under spending no matter how much you do. And the second one, if you think the Obama stimulus used to talk about shovel-ready projects, it's in the memoranda. It's the same thing. There's just a lack of stuff we can do, despite the fact there never really seems to be a lack of stuff if you ever travel by Amtrak. But that's just me. All right, so anyway, that's the Treasury view. They have their own version of this. There was, however, another version, which was the Keynesian moment, which I like to call teaching birds how to fly. Because again, to quote Joan Robinson on this one, at the very moment that Keynes was writing about how to cure unemployment, Herr Hitler was curing it. You're writing down the formalism after the fact. You're getting the theory. But what drove it, the social demands for relief from austerity, wir sind für Adolf Hitler. That were the miners. They were the working classes. This guy was a joke in 1928 before all the money left the country, when there was the seniority swap in the Dawes Plan. And what happens when all the money leaves and goes back to the United States? Austerity as far as the eye can see under Brüning. Cut, 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 cut. And as Professor Sherby Berman's book details, in 1930, what was a Nazi share of the vote? And what was it in 31? You remember your own stats? 18%. And then in 1932, 30-something%. And then by the time it was 33 he was elected, it was 43% of the vote. People laughing at Golden Dawn now should take note of this process. But what actually happens as the war, unfortunately, unfolds out of the chaos that is caused by this in part, is that there's a whole new way of thinking about the economy. And in a sense, Keynes or Keynesianism or events or both overturn austerity. The first and important one is the notion of fallacies of composition. What's true about one person is not true about the system. This is true for labour markets and money markets. This is why you get paradox of thrift. This is why you get liquidity traps. And this is why today, in modern version of austerity, everyone trying to save at once simply increases the debt. You can't all simultaneously run a surplus. It's impossible. That was learned at that point the hard way. Second one, investment is social. It's not based upon Ricardian expectations. It's based upon very short-sighted myopic signals. If everyone thinks that they're not going to make any money, they don't invest now. And what happens in the future? You don't make any money, so you get massive confirmation bias. And then that just continues to replicate itself. So it's hard to get out because, in a sense, you're kind of depressed. So the notion that you get to the bottom of the cycle, and as Andrew Mellon, Treasury Secretary under Hoover, said, the good people will come along, rottenness will be purged from the system again, emetic economics, and then you will pick it up and start again. Well, they waited for 14 years for people to pick it up. There seemed to be a shortage of competent people. And the result of this, page 104 of the General Theory, was a revolution because it said far from investment coming just from savings, as axiomatically as the liberals had assumed, consumption, it should be to repeat the obvious, is the sole end of economic activity. And when you do that, you change the way you think about the whole problem of austerity. Because if consumption increases national income, and that's what drives real wage growth, the last thing you want to go is slashing your budget when you're in a recession. It just doesn't make any sense. There's also a political message here, which I think is the one that we really forget now. Democracy is asset insurance for the rich, and they're skimping on the payments. And then if you think about it, redistribution and debt is not a pathology, it's the reinsurance contract for democracy. And that's kind of written into the script of this way of thinking. Schumpeter retreats. If you read Capitalism and Socialism and Democracy, it's a wonderful text. He spends 80 pages arguing whether or not Marx is a business cycle theorist and then says, who knows? He never directly actually talks about Keynes, apart from in 2 lines, where he says that creative destruction happens over many centuries, so the position of the economy at any point in time cannot be accurately judged. So in other words, yeah, things suck, but it could be worse. Lord Keynes's ideas to him were laughable. What had actually happened was that economies of scale and plant and equipment had led to the death of the entrepreneur. And if you really get through that book, it's a wonderful, wonderful treatise, because what's driving the whole thing isn't this emergence of a consumptive economy or the structural transformation of the economy. It's the end of the entrepreneur, the end of bourgeois virtue, and above all, the end of the bourgeois family. It's this wonderful anomic conservative society falls apart. Now, if you're going to take on someone, you can retreat into stuff like this and tell everyone it's a morality play, which austerity is also. Or you can actually address it directly. He chose not to address it directly. So you think it's dead. Not quite. It's just a long winter. Who's this? $10 for anyone who gets it. Walter Eucken. This is the father of ordoliberalism. See, the Germans had an interesting history, and still do, and this is why they do what they do in the Eurozone today. They're more like Japan than they are like the US. They're an export-led economy that was a late industrializer that had a heavy role for the state, partly because they tried to do liberalism. They had this thing called the founders' crisis. There was a huge stock market bubble. The whole thing blew up. At that point, Bismarck said, to hell with this. There was the marriage of iron and rye, and you end up with a very different form of capitalism, which is about suppressing consumption and then increasing high rates of investment, putting them through competitive firms, and then exporting away so that your source of demand lies outside. If you have that type of economic structure, Keynesianism doesn't make any sense. Because all it's going to do is push up your unit labour costs and make you less competitive, so you're not going to sell anything. So Keynes has never had a home in Germany. So after the war, what happened was the Freiburg liberals, the ones who basically weren't discredited by association with the Nazis, or at least not too much, were the guys who were able to, in a sense, write the new economic script for Germany. And they talked about the economic constitution, the importance of rules, the notion that competition, particularly on products, is what improves things in the world. And most importantly, the importance of a strong, independent central bank, so that you have price stability is the most important thing. Does that remind you of anything? Maybe like the EU? Sound money in CBI? You crowd out Keynes locally. In America, you have Hayek and others, the emigres, the Austrians who don't give up. who continue to tell the story about banks and leverage and credit extension, the beguiling of the entrepreneur, the allure of debt, and the continuing relevance of the binge and purge model, with the one big message: whatever you do, don't intervene. The nice thing about this story is modern post-war economics, in its Keynesian version and also in its neoclassical version, you could do an entire graduate program in this field and never do a class in money, credit, and banking. Money is neutral in the long run. An asset is just somebody else's income. Why would you even care about it? The Austrians got one thing right: banks matter. Credit is money. It's private money, and it can have really disruptive effects in the economy. So when the financial crisis hit and everyone's looking around going, what the hell has happened? There was a bunch of people who had a ready-made story that seemed to fit the facts quite well. The Austrians, they never ever went away. They had that story down. And that do not intervene message, a very, very powerful message, particularly here. So in the long run, in the macro sense, you have austerity as enablers. Milton Friedman on the left, Jim Buchanan on the right. Because if you think about what the whole neoliberal shift was, both in policy and economic theory, you have monetarism and inflation rather than full employment and growth. The natural rate hypothesis that basically says government can't really do that much about employment in the long run. Public choice comes along and basically says politicians are not representatives of the people. They're rent seekers, and they're basically just trying to mesh the thing for their own self-interest. Given this, democracy isn't a virtue, it's a problem, and central bank independence is the solution, because the last thing you want is the people you elect to make choices for you. And then you technify all this with rational expectations, efficient markets, Ricardian equivalence, and all the rest. And what you end up with is a self-calibrating system where government has no role to play, and the notion that you would basically do any kind of Keynesian strategy becomes simply laughable. We're back in a pre-classical world. You have crowded out Keynes globally. And you can try this by road testing it. Take it around the world. It was called structural adjustment programs. It was an unmitigated disaster, but you don't admit that. You basically write a report to the IMF in 2004 that says the problem was everybody who you subjected to the tests. They all just didn't try hard enough. That's why it didn't work. Nothing wrong with the theory. It just doesn't try hard enough itself. But then a really interesting part of the story comes along when you get to Italy. Because it turns out, to quote Milton Friedman, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, for those of you who speak Italian or Italian English, there is a free lunch if you skip your dinner. And this is the theory of expansionary austerity. And this actually goes back again to those Ordo liberals, those German Ordo liberals, because they weren't just German. This guy, Luigi Einaudi, right, who was one of the first major post-war Italian politicians and also the finance minister and chief banker and so on and so forth, basically wrote a lot of stuff about how the state was a total pathology. Now, if I grew up in Italy, I might think that the state was total pathology as well. Let's be fair here. But not all states are equivalent. More importantly, he was a big visionary for Europe, and he saw Europe as a disciplinary device, a way of keeping state budgets in order to stop them spending by having them all in one common market and having one common currency. He set up the Bocconi School of Milan, which was basically sort of a public school, Virginia public choice, done even better and more technical in Milan rather than in Virginia. And out of this come a whole slew of PhD students that after 1970 began to occupy critical positions in graduate programs in the United States, who then staffed IMF desks and also senior positions here. Chief of them being, irony of ironies, the current head of the economics department at Harvard. Schumpeter, I give you Alicina. Now, what's going on the other side of this story? Well, here's the actual story. Now you talk about the most important in all this. The most important thing here is confidence, right? Business doesn't invest because it doesn't have confidence, right? Well, if you're on the Keynesian side of things, you go, yeah, because you don't know the future. Nobody invests in a recession. You look to each other. Nobody else is investing. You don't invest, and you end up stuck in a slump. Yeah, very simple. Ah, not so. Because according to this one, you have people who have very long-sighted rational expectations. They understand time and consistency problems and all that. So what it means is the economy might be falling down around your ears. You might not know if you have a job next week, but you really care about government bond rates and inflation rates. And you also care about the size of the debt. Keeps you up at night. Seriously, the technical papers, they actually make these claims. Now, because of that, what you do is you look for credible signals of government expenditure cuts. So when they credibly signal to tear down the state, this is a wonderful thing because it tells you 20 years from now you'll be paying less taxes. And because you'll be paying less taxes now, in the future, you turn around and go, that's brilliant, I'll spend money now, in the middle of a recession when I might not have a job next week. And then this is great, it'll cure the recession. That is actually the argument for the confidence theory. I'm not being facetious. When you strip it away, that's exactly what it says. It assumes that there's basically the debt and politicians' handling of debt is time inconsistent, they can't be trusted. The only thing you can do is credibly signal to basically cut that debt so that you send a strong signal that future income will be higher. And therefore, the thing you should do is always cut, and cut drastically, and cut big, and cut in the middle of a recession, not at the boom, in the slump. That is the time to do it. Now, the cases that were meant to make this case, Ireland, Sweden, Canada, Denmark, and Australia in the 1980s. In the book, I go through all of them, and I went through the technical analysis as well. And basically, they don't show any such thing. To take one example, the biggest one, Canada, is a good one. I don't actually do Canada in the book, but Ireland is similar. Ireland's main trading partner is Britain. British economy is 9 times the size of Ireland. British economy goes through an export boom, and its exchange rate gets more expensive. Ireland devalues by 30%. What do you think happens? They go on a boom. When they get an export-led boom, what do? They pay back debt. It's the completely Keynesian story. It has nothing to do with expectations or anything else. And that's pretty much what happens in every single one of those cases. Problem with this is it's believed because it's useful, because it becomes basically the meme of the G20 and then the G20 finance ministers group. Alessina's Ecofin brief basically is lifted chapter and verse and written into the ECB report from June 2010. It's all about Ricardian consumers making long-sighted decisions. How if we cut debt now, we'll actually have more money going forward. It becomes the framework for what's called the 2009 Vienna Agreement, a fascinating little bit that people didn't really pay attention to. Basically, if you go back to that graph of all the bond yields, Eastern Europe is out there in 2000. The big European banks look at it and think, these guys are going to be in the euro one day, so they're undervalued assets. If I buy them now, I get them cheap. When they come in the euro, boom, this is an instant capital gain. This is fabulous. The people who are running these states, given the post-communist heritage, are like, sure, whatever. You want FDI openness? Brilliant. No controls? Absolutely. Own 100% of our banking sector? Why the hell not? So between 80 and 100% of the banking sector of these countries in Eastern Europe, Latvia, Baltics, etc., Romania, and a couple of others, become foreign-owned. Along comes the credit crisis. The banks turn around and say, we want our money back, please. They've actually de facto privatized their money supply. This is not going to end well. So basically, the EC and the IMF get together and basically use the framework of the Ecofin agreement to come along and say, here's the idea, guys. Wait a minute. How about this? They promised to keep the depositors' money there and not move it to Sweden, so long as you guarantee the senior bondholders of Swedish and German banks by committing to cut the pensions of your pensioners by 30%. That is why the Baltics and everybody had to do that huge amount of austerity in the first place. Now, they get celebrated as a great case because they bounced back. You know why they bounced back? They stopped doing austerity. First, do no harm. If do not intervene as a principle in the economy, it's symmetrical. It doesn't just apply to spending, it applies to cuts too. It becomes the structure of periphery bailouts, cuts not taxes, and the result of this is where I started, the greatest bait and switch in modern history, where pensioners bail bankers for states who have spent too much, but all they did was basically bail their financial systems, or bail themselves out of the stupid choices they made over their financial systems a decade previously. But does reality bite? We begin to see defections from the Bocconi school. Self-criticism in economics is rare. Pay attention when it starts to emerge. The IMF begins to challenge these expansionary fiscal hypotheses, and the 2012 World Economic Outlook calculates the negative multiplier effect of government spending is between minus 1.5 and minus 1.7, which means for every buck that you cut, you lose $1.50 to $1.70. That would kind of explain why Greece and Spain are falling off a cliff, and you have 60% unemployment and under 25s. The reality of this is a nasty austerity politics that comes out of the austerity policies. Beppe Grillo is round one. It's really funny to basically take your paranoid version of Stephen Colbert and give him 25% of the vote. But it doesn't stop there, because you can't form a functioning government. Your technocrats no longer have any credibility. What's your next trick? The Golden Dawn? Back in the day when the ERM, the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, was around, the Brits had a joke for it. They used to call it the eternal recession mechanism. This is the new ERM. Because if you're still the same story, if you can't inflate and you can't devalue, and you don't have a proper central bank, the only damn thing you can do is continue to add liquidity, squeeze, and pray. That's a time-limited trick. Your alternative is to raise taxes, the exact opposite of this, but raising taxes in a recession is also costly. They've dug themselves a very deep hole, and it's not at all clear how they're going to get out of it. And if you think for any moments, these guys, the Rebel Alliance, you know, it's always the pigs and the gypsies, this one's mine, the Rebel Alliance. Romania, Estonia, Bulgaria, and Latvia, and Lithuania. If they, I know, it's all special effects. If you think these guys are the way forward, just remember this. If you go to the Eurobarometer data, and you look up Estonia for 2011, when they were at the height of their growth spurt, 75% of the respondents in the Eurobarometer survey said that the condition and the economic condition of their country was terrible, and 91% said it was likely to get worse. That's not exactly a sign of hopeful expectations and the confidence fairy doing its magic. And yet, sadly, it continues. So to go back to the very start and finish on this one, why did I write this book? Because there's nothing worse than watching something that you think is really important destroying itself. The European political project has been a tremendous success. If you'd said to somebody in 1990 that you could extend democracy, the rule of law, all the way to the Euros, with the exception of Serbia and a few other places, put that to one side, sorted out by the Americans as usual, sorry, you would have got long odds, and yet it worked. But you had to build a monetary union on top of it, with stunningly incomplete institutions and no political consensus on how to extend them. This is the result, particularly when you're blind to something the Austrians knew all along. Credit bubbles are dangerous. And if at the end of the day, your central bank denies they even exist or they can do anything about them, as was the case with the Fed, as was the case with the ECB, you are going to reap the whirlwind. And that's where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you for this a truly extraordinary tour de force. I wanted to comment on a couple of points, introduce some questions that regard history, but also all that we might have to look at to address the problem of austerity, which you've already greatly expanded on. First of all, we just have to appreciate the strong way that you have addressed the history of economic thinking, a question which you've addressed over time, but seems to be particularly important the way you've set it up here. That is to bring together, if you want, several schools, both continental, American, British, of thinking, starting with the liberal British, which is, a way. One could also start with the continent. Clearly Marx is not here. But to see in this liberal synthesis, which in the 1920s is dominated by Keynesianism, that there are different liberal assessments at work, and then in this new crisis of Keynesianism, that one gets actually quite different ways, so that this way of seeing, if you almost look like a path dependency, the Anaudes creeping out. The consummate form is Monti, if you want, in the technocratic area, but that you get then the Ordo liberals coming out, pure forms of austerity thinking, that it's more difficult in France for all sorts of reasons, that going back to Say, there is this obsession with consumption and the commodity, which makes this kind of liberal austerity view very, very difficult to sort of intimately embrace. That in your own training, coming out of Strathclyde, that the obverse of the Keynesianism is, Keynes's notions of consumption were, very much, in some ways economistic, and there was always the problem then of what will happen when these workers start guzzling and the quality of culture goes down because people are, in a frenzy, engaged in cheap culture, and therefore the state's going to have to intervene to boost the whole level. Now, so I think that's a terribly important move, because it means that behind this sort of new consensus around austerity, there are actually very different liberal economic visions, and it might make it much more difficult then to come out with this new notion that is behind any new policy. There's going to be very deeply different inflections in the euro area. What is spending? What would be a social democracy coming out of that? what is the relationship between public spending and private consumption. And across the Atlantic, there are very, I think, rather different. So, while in Europe it's keeps being said that Obama is a Keynesian, okay, and the Europeans have to now act that way, but then the moment they look around, it can't be Hollande, it can't be X, it can't be Y, it can't be this, because those are all bankrupt alternatives to austerity. And then when we come and look at Obama, we say this really is, managing the debt, which the Americans can do, but there is no program of restructuring that bears any works progress administration, any of those notions of how to restructure and how to grow in a period of vast crisis, when indeed the West doesn't have any more the kind of leadership, the kinds of capacities to do what it did, if you want, in that Keynesian moment. So now, I had a couple of sort of questions points of history, if you want to ask you about. One is this Keynesian moment, which in some ways he's already formulating it coming out of the Great War, that there is an opposite to austerity. And I think you're absolutely right to say this is not about equity, it's not about inequality in itself, it's necessity constrained by labor struggles, constrained by the idea, pushed by the very idea of rationing during the war, which increased levels of consumption absurdly, but that was so. And it was a question of indeed how you would grow capitalism again. So this project, and then it's implicit in your work, there are a huge amount of struggles which had to take place. Keynes says loud and clear in 1919 that the cake of consumption can't be cut in the way it's been. It's got to be now grown. The cake of consumption, we can't keep recutting the very small cake. And he has, clearly Germany is very deep in his mind. In people who related to him, they're also very deeply concerned about the structure of Europe, that it's divided so sharply between a periphery which doesn't consume, a rural which doesn't consume, an imperial structure which is so structured such that it can't grow because of the barriers, because of the structure of markets. The experiments, well, I don't think that Nazism was a Keynesian experiment, but that is, so there is a whole range, and in effect, none of them work within Europe. Maybe the Popular Front works, all said and done, but in any case, in the French anomaly. So it's not until there's a major shift in the global redivision of labor with the United States that you could get the embrace of Keynesianism, even though it's not really Keynesianism. So, all right. So this one question is, how long is this going to take? In other words, the problem of the sort of the trajectory, that this is not just policy. You say, do we need class struggle? Are you talking about it's going to have to be social struggle, coalitions? What are the forces that, in some sense, the political forces, the political engagements? In other words, saving Europe is not a policy solution here, though it may be an effect. The second moment, you might want to bring back that 1992, the bond question. The slide at the very beginning, it's almost more of a mnemonic device because I'm not using the specifics, but if you, it's fascinating. Okay, and it's a question.
There we go.
Yeah, there it is. So this whole question, say that you've got now this question of the spreads, and then you're going to get the convergence, and then the euro, in some sense, is going to be their key. Comes back to, so what lies behind the euro? In other words, we're saying, it doesn't work. It does this, it does that. But if you go back to look at the moment of the euro, there were so many, if you want, notions of political economy which merged into it. And it was also a moment when to get into it required enormous amounts of deflation, which were especially felt in the periphery. And then, as you're remarking, then get compensated for by cheap credit and so on. And this is another part of your argument. So we can think of this this historical moment that clearly so much goes into creating abundance, if you want to say that's the alternative, and I'm not sure if we do. And at the same time, this moment of entering into the age of austerity may have a powerful prehistory in the period of the 90s that's not only about financial capital, but it's already setting limits and also incentives to say, okay, if we want Europeans to be equal and united, they better all have the same standard of living. You cannot have Greeks who don't have telephones or computers, or who look raggy, who have rotten teeth, who are, all the qualities that we used to associate with class and social differences. And so that becomes a virtue. So I'm wondering if you can, in other words, at the same time as, we think, if you've got austerity, what would be the new abundance? What would be the qualities of it? At the same time, before the austerity, let's say, which you have as in a sense, sort of a finance policy connected to finance capitalism, is there a whole set of sort of social, a more general redivision of global labor that's beginning, which underlies it?
So nice small questions then, right?
Yeah,
All right.
and
Just
then
to get
we
us
can go
kicked
for
off.
smaller ones.
I will be brief so we can bring in other people, so I'm sure they have questions. What lies behind the euro? I like to think that psychoanalysis is a wonderful way of looking at this. There's a term in psychoanalysis called the fantastical object. So if you think of the market utopia, the fantastical object is something which is there only in theory, but itself, its presence, is just a thing which is like an attractor. It has to be there. It's the next step. A little while ago, I interviewed Gerhard Schröder, and I asked him, I said, what were you thinking about? I mean, seriously, the Greeks hadn't run a budget surplus, hadn't run a balanced budget in 50 years. What were you doing? He said, well, first of all, it wasn't my project. It was handed to me. Second thing was, the Bundesbank were screaming blue murder. They wanted nothing to do with it, but they knew that they had to do it. So they wrote a constitution they hoped everyone would reject, and they ended up signing it. And then the third thing that made it crazy was we let the Greeks in anyway, and we knew the Italians were cooking the books and the whole lot, because at the end of the day, none of us really saw it as an economic project. We thought it was a political project. It's not. It's a hugely consequential set of economic institutions and decisions which now have come home to roost. So the political classes that were in charge of it basically had no idea what they were doing. That's what was behind the euro. Now, would they have been better if they'd been advised by a team of economists? Hell no. The way that monetary orders and political orders emerge is evolutionary over periods of time, with trial and error, with redundancies. The worst thing about the EMU as opposed to the European political project, the European political project is kind of an open-ended contract. You deal with stuff as it comes up. You see what happens. You talk to each other. It's based upon trust. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. Just sort of, disaggregated trust in a sense. So what is the European Monetary Union based upon? Moral hazard. Everybody's out to stoop everybody else, and you can't trust anyone. The only thing you can do is have rules, and everybody has to obey them, even though you know they won't, and you knew that right from the start. But think about this as a Hayekian problem, right? Hayek often gets the blame for being the guy who rails against social democracy and the planner. You could think about EMU as Hayekian madness. Because the idea is, regardless of where you are in the global division of labour, regardless of your social formations and classes, regardless of what you produce and how you do it, you will have a 60% debt to GDP ratio. You will have low inflation. And if we just parameterize the system in this way, in a sense, I don't need to know what the future will bring, because it will be within this nice little probability space that I've carved out by everybody adhering to the same rules. That is insane. And that's what was really behind the euro. Very briefly, in terms of what are the political forces involved, time's arrow doesn't flow backwards. We're not going back to Keynesianism. It doesn't work like that. If you want to look at the way I look at the world just now, I look at it in three segments. There's basically the vertically integrated Asian global value chain, which basically produces using FDI and domestic capital that exports to two consumption centres. That's Europe and then the United States. One of those consumption centres has decided to stop consuming. Well, there's obviously going to be repercussions for that. And then the other one basically is saving itself only because its government doesn't work. Because if it did work, it would probably join in with the Europeans. So if you think about the world as sort of these disaggregated production and consumption centres, it's no longer about national capitalisms or people, struggling for domestic labour or social justice. All of that goes on, but it's happening at a level far, far above that and beyond the notion even of financialisation. I'm quite correct in that sense. So I don't actually see the sort of the traditional story of social forces grappling with the domestic economy as actually having any analytic purchase in what's going on at the moment, sadly. This is an era which technocrats thought they could tame, but unfortunately, I like to put it, their epistemic hubris has dug us a hellhole.
Hi, Mark.
Hello, Sherry.
This was great. I have a question about where you ended. I mean, how much of the European story can be told simply by your last sentence, which is that you got austerity because there were no institutions in place to do anything else, right? You yourself said so. They couldn't do much else. There was no institutions, political institutions, capable of responding even in the minimal way that the United States has responded. So all of that intellectual history, interesting, but probably unnecessary, right? Because there were no institutions there to implement anything else. And let's be clear, right, that the Germans are among the most pro-political integration of the Europeans. And so they are more in favor of putting in place, and had been even before the crisis, putting in place political institutions that might have been able to respond differently to the crisis. So what else could the Europeans have done, even if they didn't have these ideas, which actually I'm not sure most of them did. I mean, domestically they don't. I mean, part of the problem is that Germans don't care about Greeks the way they care about their own citizens, just like Swedes and Dutch, who would never cut their own policies towards their citizens in the way that they're very happy to see Southern Europeans suffer. But the basic problem here is a lack of institutions capable of doing anything else. And again, the Germans have been among the most willing to move forward in that.
Now, here's why I would say that's absolutely true, but you have to ask another prior question, which is what are the ideas that are informing the institutional designs? And the institutional design of the EU is deeply ordoliberal. A competition authority that basically issues edicts, that does lots and lots of stuff, and a central bank that guarantees price stability to Borales. That's basically it. If you look at the ideas for fiscal integration that are going forward, it's based upon notions such as the Schuldenbremsen, the debt brake, so that everybody's going to run a surplus at once. Right? Okay, that's just patent nonsense. That can't actually work in practice. As Martin Wolf put it beautifully, who are we all going to export to? Martians? Who are we going to run a surplus against? So there's a very, very powerful ideological current here that is deeply imbued with, I think, an ordoliberal spirit that is the architecture and design of the European project. And it wasn't when people said, let's consciously set it up. It kind of became that because, in a sense, they were the people building and because nobody else was doing it. And it didn't matter so long as there were huge, colossal credit flows basically covering everything up. It only mattered once that disappeared. And that's when it became not a problem of, like, if they had the right institutions. If they could build any institutions they wanted tomorrow, they would build stupid institutions. They would build institutions that would make the problem worse. That's why the ideas are important.
Yeah. Well, I can project anyway. So I have a question about the intellectual origins, and particularly the way you associate the idea of austerity with the ordoliberal project.
It's one of its sources.
Right. So actually, proponents of ordoliberalism would say, from what I understand, they like to take credit for the social market economy. They like to take credit for Germany's combination of this economic model with its quite extensive welfare provisions. So is that just a sort of convenient way of taking credit for ideas that they didn't originate or account for? Is that just revisionist history
It's a stunning revisionist history. Here's what actually happened. There's a wonderful dissertation that was written at the EUI last year, and I know this because I was on the committee. And it was by a young German scholar. It was called The Religious Origins of the Italian and German Welfare States. And there's a wonderful symmetry that goes on here. So basically, if you go back to why it is that Germany has the world's first welfare state when you're dealing with Bismarck, it's always been a bit of a puzzle, right? Well, it's about basically breaking the back of the socialists, right? Well, they could have done a deal with the socialists. There was lots of moves in the parliament to actually do a deal with the socialists. Some of the socialists really wanted to do a deal, but he decided to do a deal with the Catholics. And when you're doing a deal with the Catholics, you basically have to deal with papal encyclicals and organic conceptions of society and so on and so forth, rather than class conceptions which were less threatening to capital. Now, interesting thing, what happens in 1945 that everybody knows but nobody thinks about? All the Protestants leave, they end up in the GDR. And what happens in 1945 is the Walter Eucken type coming out of Freiburg, they don't want any welfare state at all. It's in their rights, they don't want any of this stuff. We're going to be good liberals. Finally, we're going to be good liberals. And what happens is the Americans say to them, I don't think you should do that. Because the Americans running the place are all New Dealers. And they're the ones who say you should have active labour market policies. So the Walter Eucken and these guys, basically, Wohlstand für alle, the whole sort of the thing that's going out about freeing price controls, etc., it runs into a brick wall when the Korean War kicks off. And the German economy goes into a very steep slump in 50 and 51. And at that point, the Americans go, no, 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 no. You're building a welfare state and you're building one now. That's what actually happened. Now, here's an interesting little twist that I'd never actually say as a scholar, but I'll say it anyway because I'm here. What happens in 1990? The Protestants come back. Hello, Angela. Have a look at German family policy now. It's not very Catholic. It's very individualist. It's all about keeping mum out of the labour market once again, but for very different reasons. So I don't buy that story.
But there might be some confusion here, cause and effect. I mean, that the sense of spaces are opened up in crisis. There is a kind of path trajectory that is out of what seemed like a certain kind of unity, Western society of abundance, Keynesianism with all sorts of inflections, differences certainly in the nature of the welfare state and its origins. I think that we know a lot about. Sometimes some have more Catholic, some there are all sorts of combinations and permutations, and Sherry and others have dealt with. Now, if you start to move into another moment, let's say this austerity moment, and I think you're saying, okay, this is not simply the financialization, the fiscal. You could expect that there are whole sets of ways of legitimating it, and that then I can say, okay, then the religiosity comes in, a Protestant inflection, a Margaret Thatcher type inflection. I mean,
Swabian housewives.
Yeah, but that we don't want to say that then go back. I think we're going to see a huge proliferation of different ways of managing this and of legitimating it, and that seems to be an area that we're going to have to go and just and anecdotally about during the Prodi moment that is in the 90s when there was a lot of deflating in Italy in order to get in. I remember colleagues were talking about their children, especially the male children who coming out of the 90s were having a lot of trouble getting wives, having children, finding jobs. And we began to joke about this sort of the new Franciscanism, the new movements of sort of the St. Francis types, that is, of young people who, were kind of moving around looking for a cause. And, now one thinks of, the new Pope Francis and, kind of legitimating of a new kind of austerity or, sort of alternatives to the mass consumption. But, one can expect then in this that there's going to be, that how do you re-legitimate a new notion of middle class? In other words, both continuing the crisis as an austerity model is going to involve enormous kinds of leverage, ideological leverage, and one would expect it's going to be fairly local. But ditto this other, way. In other words, how does one legitimate a new kind of political economy, which is the alternative? And that's, my question. Other.
Fascinating talk. Really, right. Sorry, thank you. Question that comes immediately. In the case
Can you
of,
speak into the front of the mic?
in case of imposing austerity on Club Med or the pigs or whatever you want to call them, you see a confluence of both bad ideas and interests, right? I mean, there are some powerful interests. But when it comes to why doesn't, one very obvious question, why doesn't Germany reflect? Right? Is that purely bad ideas there, or are there some interests who are also against German reflation? What are those interests?
Well, part of it is if you, I don't have the German banking slide up there, but I mean, part of the book was basically trying to work out the actual operational leverage of different European banks. They don't publish this stuff. You're going to have to work it out in many cases. And Deutsche Bank is 86% of German GDP, one bank. And it turns out that there's now a lawsuit going through the courts here in the United States because they were bust in the crisis. And they just lied. They just flat out lied about their derivatives book. They held it in the trading book, and refused to move it to the banking book, even though it was bust, so they couldn't acknowledge the loss. I mean, just flat out lied, if that's true, right? So there's tremendous political power here involved, because if Deutsche Bank goes bang, so does the German economy. I mean, it's game over, so they'll do anything to stop this. Now, let me be sympathetic to the German point of view. The big problem Germany's always had, and it's a new version of sort of the German problem in a way, is they're not big enough to be a financial superpower, but they're too big to be everyone's neighbour. And they actually run an operating model which is a bit like Switzerland. Switzerland's only possible because everyone else is not Switzerland. You need to have one place you can hide your assets because the assets are generated somewhere else. Well, Germany basically is kind of like a local version of China. It imports other people's incomes, gets demand from outside the union, and then basically sells them their own debt back to themselves. I mean, it's sort of a Chinese sort of thing with treasury bills, a very similar thing. So when you are in that position, you can't fix this problem unilaterally. So this creates a real problem for them, because what might make sense is to leave. But if they leave, the real exchange rate bomb right through the roof, and the export model gets clobbered. And nobody wants to take the political hit for this. So this is a prison for the Germans as much as it is for anybody else. Now, the solution that they have, and to go back to Sherry's point, the weakness in the solution that they have, I think you see this with some very interesting policy decisions the Germans have made. In the wake of the Fukushima incident, they decided they were done with nuclear power. And if you follow the internal discussion on this, although there wasn't that much of it, the cross-party consensus was just, we're all going to do this, it's done. There's nobody arguing about it. But what was filtering through was a kind of a one-way bet on the future, which was, we're actually not crazy people. We believe in global warming. And we know that we have the smartest engineers on the planet. So if we basically get our minds together and do this, we can figure out green tech. Because if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be us. And if we do it, we can print money for the next 150 years. We can sell it to China, everything, because the Americans aren't going to do it. They don't believe in the damn thing. So this is sort of the discourse in the engineers, and they're going to do this thing. Now, here's the problem. You then have this crazy idea of a debt break, which means that you can't do the loss-leading investments that you would need, because debt is an investment in the future to actually make those types of technologies even remotely possible. So they've decided they're going to cancel nuclear power, sign up to 30 years of extra dependence on the Russians, and then they're going to somehow innovate with absolutely no loss-leading capital budget to do so, because the government can't run any debts or deficits. That's why their ideas behind their institutions are stupid. So that's how I think about the problem. They're caught between a rock and a hard place of their own making, and they don't know how to get out of it.
Interesting.
Actually, just on this point of the relationship between ideas and institutions that Emmanuelle flagged in your introduction, I was wondering, I mean, you sort of necessarily had to be very fast in your presentation if you're covering 250 years in half an hour. But if you could reflect, sort of because you were going so quickly, you almost got the impression, at least I did in the audience, of economists sort of just as these mouthpieces for this political economic elite at its stupidest.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could reflect more on the specific causal mechanism that you see here, like connecting ideas and institutions. And then, again, sort of, that's an incredibly broad question. And another broad question, but slightly smaller. You also, at least again, I kind of got the sense of your presentation of sort of like a steady and very significant influence of economists over policy from, say, like Hume onward.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could reflect more on the specific role of economists and their influence over policy, like especially arguably, right, there being like a huge change in the 20th century, if you could just tease that out a little bit.
Let me add something because we have actually very little time, and it's not exactly the same thing, but it's about the connections between ideas and political debates and crises, and that's something that's rather peripheral, both in the presentation and the book. But I'd like to hear more about with it, the connections between the crisis of democracy and austerity and the consequences of austerity. You had that obviously in Germany, but you also had that in France in the 1920s and early 30s with the consequence of the going back to the franc Poincaré and all that, and you hear that nowadays. You hear that in Italy. You hear that in France. Like that there is a crisis of democracy as generated and mediated through scandals, through through financial scandals. But it's very much there. So another way of maybe adding a layer of complexity to the mechanisms.
There's a terrible tendency among social scientists to be obsessed with monocausal explanations, that there's one thing that explains this thing better than other things, when in fact the world is desperately multi-causal. So, you don't really have to choose between institutional and ideological explanations because, you just ask a simple question: where do you get your institutions from? It might be from the way you think about the problem. So let me try and put all of that together with sort of 3 brief sets of comments. One of the things I learned doing the research on this book was I read Barry Eichengreen's Golden Fetters thoroughly. We all read it in grad school, but I read it thoroughly. And he really doesn't develop the point, but there's a fantastically important insight in that book, that inflations are not caused by money printing. Money printing is caused by the failure of a political system. And when you basically have 2 sides that can't agree on who pays the bills, you start with deficits, you end up with more debt, and eventually you end up with basically trying to burn your way out of it, and it ends up badly. And that's sort of the standard story. So what's the relationship then, to go to this first point, and also to this point, between sort of ideas and crisis and causation, the whole thing? I think 2 stories are simultaneously true. The first one is the world is unbelievably complex and opaque. It's worse than that, it's deeply uncertain. What creates stability in the world are everything that we put in it. Whether those things are central banks, birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, or wars. They are this social stuff that makes the world hang together. And we think these things are sort of hard material things, but they're not. They crack under pressure a lot easier than we think, and they crack a lot more often than we do. And we have multiple stories about how they work, and each of them is kind of grabbing a bit of the elephant, so to speak. Now, how do economic narratives get privileged in this? Because they basically have the status of being scientific truths. They pretend to be a correspondence theory of an invariant world that maps onto that world non-probabilistically, but basically as an actual true reflection of the underlying physical structure of the world and the laws that govern it. And sometimes that might be true. But the world evolves, it's entropic, it's open, it's it's at random. It moves off in weird directions. And what you end up with, and a wonderful example of this is Gordon Brown's premiership along with Tony Blair, is you do end up with, so 2 things are simultaneously true. You need economic ideas to basically decode the environment and build institutions and act in it, and that gives you the stability in the world. But they're also the things that fragilize the world. Because you have Gordon Brown talking about prudence, fiscal responsibility, prudence, got to be prudent. So this goes on for years. Now, basically, you get a confirmation bias because the economy is going up, house prices are going up, Labour's being re-elected, prudence, more prudence. So you just keep saying this thing over and over again, and it kind of maps onto the reality. What's actually happening is a colossal housing bubble and a massive financialisation of the British economy. So the reality in the theory, which may have been here at one point, start to do this. And then what happens is you have a convexity built into this. That basically things look stable, think, oh crap. And all it takes is that one thing to push it over. Could be the nationalisation of Northern Rock, could be American mortgages, whatever. And suddenly prudence with a purpose just isn't believable anymore. Because what he's been doing for the past decade is teaching birds how to fly. People have been doing it, and you've been telling a story about how it works, and because it matches the reality, we kind of believe it, but it actually doesn't cause it. The causal chains are completely different. So simultaneously, you can have ideas as desperately important in terms of the way we interact. They're our interface with the world because they privilege certain forms of knowledge in the way that we detail our interactions and our practices. But at the same time, there can be utter fairy stories and fabrications, which we treat as totems, which can be completely wrong, which we can happily live in until the world slaps us. And that's how I think those two things happen simultaneously. Now, you might say, well, that's completely contradictory, Professor Blyth, because you can't have A and not A simultaneously. Well, you can if A and not A are not one of a kind. And we live in a world where it ain't the same thing. There's lots of ain't the same things out there.
Yes.
Thanks so much. I left your talk thinking that you were suggesting that maybe the ECB should have the same level of flexibility that Bernanke has. Can you talk a little bit about some solutions, some suggestions?
Let's put this in context. Why do we have central banks? They were originally, in many cases still are, the Swiss National Bank is a good example of this, private corporations. And they're there basically for one purpose, to make sure that somebody has the monopoly issue of script, because that's a very, very important political resource and it should be controlled. That's ultimately why they're there. Now, we have a weird system going on in both Europe and the United States here where none of the fiscal institutions actually work. The Europeans forgot to build them. They thought they were unnecessary because if everybody obeys the rules. Paul de Grooy has a wonderful line about this. It says, so long as everyone scrupulously obeys the fire code, there's no need for a fire brigade. Right, I mean, and that's really where that kind of logic leads. On the other hand, what you have here is the fiscal system, Congress, which is utterly broken, right? And you can't get a damn thing through it. Consequently, what's happened is the monetary authority, which really can't and shouldn't really try to do that much, has had to do everything. So I actually don't think it's costless to take on the entire debt of the American banking system and dump it on the Fed's balance sheet. I think it's potentially highly dangerous. I don't think that people who are unelected should have the rights to do that in the first place. That is a democratic political function. And yet the people we charge with doing this are too busy debating whether we should have gun control over magazines rather than anything to do with this, and half of them don't believe in global warming. So you've got a bunch of people who are relatively reasonable most of the time who forgot to build institutions, and you've got a bunch of people who are going to be quite unreasonable who have institutions which are designed not to work. That's why you have the division of powers. Consequently, we've got two giant central banks, one of which was meant to do nothing but fighting inflation, which ended in 1924 for the rest of eternity, and another one who has a dual mandate, which, if you think about it, is completely contradictory. So it has a contradiction burned right through it. And both of these institutions are meant to fix the crisis that other institutions are meant to be there to do. So if there's a lesson in this, the lesson is profoundly negative. Ben may have done a marvellous job recapitalising the banking system and delevering it and all the rest of it. Let's not forget the cost. If you go to the website of bettermarkets.org, who's a lobbying firm who basically lobbies for financial reform, and it's funded, interestingly, by insiders who made a lot of money off of things like raping commodity markets, and I'm talking billions, and this is their guilt project. They're basically telling Congress how we really make money and you should stop us doing this. A guy called Mike Masters is involved in this. Guess what? Congress doesn't want to know. So they did their own independent audit of how much the crisis cost, and they did lost GDP in the whole 9 yards. Their estimate is $13 trillion. It's as big as the debt. So Ben's actions have not been costless. And that's the success story. So the lessons are profoundly negative, I'm afraid. The flexibility is useful in the short term, but it's costly because monetary institutions should not perform fiscal functions. Democratically elected representatives should actually discharge their mandate, raise taxes, cut spending, whatever it is we decide to do as a democracy, and stick by the contract. Instead of which they're dodging their day job and passing it off to the central bank, which the central bank is ill-equipped to do, and that is dangerous.
Okay, well,
Last question, maybe.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right in the top. If you speak right in the top, it'll work.
Huh?
Yeah,
All right, there we go. So you told a story about sort of the failure of both a currency union and sort of domestic institutions in trying to combat inflation. No, trying to combat the entire monetary crisis and then the imposition of austerity. But earlier on, you had mentioned that that the whole notion of social struggle, domestic political struggle being sort of a corrective to the issue is kind of problematic given how production and consumption have been disaggregated. And that's the story I kind of want to press you on, because the story we're always fed is even if we sort of abandon austerity, try and inflate our way out of the crisis, we've had, immense structural changes in Western economies to the point that there won't be jobs. And I mean, I'm just curious what you think about the validity of that story, because, you know, I have a lot of friends who don't get jobs.
No, absolutely.
And how do you deal with that? Because that seems to be the long-term issue about prosperity.
That is absolutely the long-term issue. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe in global development?
I like the idea.
Are you willing to pay for it? Because it necessarily means wage cuts in the core. That's the dirty little secret. Here's dirty little secret number 2. You don't need everybody to work when you have an economy globally that can produce superabundance. You have a distributional problem. And the distributional problem is, again, something that the democratically elected representatives are meant to deal with, and they singularly refuse to do it. They'll give you more student loans so that you're more indebted rather than deal with the actual things they need to deal with. So there are some really significant problems there. But let's not be too pessimistic. I am Scottish, I know, but let's try and lighten it a little bit. Why do I live here? I live in the United States for a couple of reasons. Number one, I grew up in Scotland, as you can tell. And when you're unemployed in Scotland, you turn around, and this is very Thatcherite of me, God rest her soul. In the following sense, if you're unemployed, it's the government's fault. You're in the United States, you're unemployed, it's your fault. That creates a tremendous flexibility that you don't have, and that's often seen as a good thing, and to a certain extent there it is. But what if there are actually no jobs? You can have all the flexibility you won't create it, particularly if you're constraining consumption at the same time in some effort to pay back debt, misguided or guided or whatever. You've got a big problem there. So, what's the happy story? The happy story is this. The United States manages to actually do well despite its government. It's still, despite... Anybody here does IR in political science? Anybody here studied IR? The whole field was founded on the idea that America was in decline in the 1970s. You remember the film Rising Sun? Anybody ever seen that particularly racist piece of nonsense? Well, that was when Japan was going to run everything. They released the film and Japan went into a 15-year recession. Now enemy of the month is China. And then you got all this nonsense about China owns the USA, and it's completely the other story. We've had the best deal ever. It's basically a free option on the Chinese investment vehicle. Basically, they send us televisions and we send them bits of paper bearing 2%, and there's no way for them to get out of it. And Congress wants to accuse them of being a currency manipulator and end this relationship. It's utterly moronic. So it's good to be the king. And the nice thing about being the king and having an economy which is robust to the shocks of its idiotic political class is that it does bounce back when left alone. And it will bounce back. The United States is already growing. There'll be fits and starts, but it will be back up. And the thing that cures debt better than anything else actually isn't inflation, it's growth. And a little inflation. And eventually, that big financial sector that caused a lot of problems, that's shrinking. That's going to be half the size it is. And you still got better terms of startups and technological innovation, the whole lot. Germans kick your ass in engineering, but not much else. We decry American manufacturing. We say, oh, it's only 11% of the economy. That's about $1.3 trillion, which is about half your average European country's GDP, not to be sniffed at. So there are huge structural changes. There are huge structural problems. But I would rather face them in this country than any other country.
Okay.
On this note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We wish you huge luck with the book. It's available.
Yes, please buy the book. Otherwise, my children will starve.
Right there.